So welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2022 Ashtekar Frontiers of Science lectures presented by the Everly College of Science. I'm your host and the introductor of the speaker. My name is Miguel Mostafa. I'm the new Associate Dean for Research and Innovation in the college. This lecture series was founded by Professor Abhay Ashtekar, who's the founding director of the Institute for Gravitation and the Cosmos and a member of the National Academy of Science. The series also owes the success to Barbara Kennedy, who presided over this series during its first 25 years, making it one of the most successful science outreach events in Pennsylvania. Today is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jia Li. She's professor of statistics and with a joint appointment in computer science at Penn State. Her research interests include machine learning, artificial intelligence, probabilistic graph models, and image analysis. She was editor-in-chief of the journal Statistical Analysis and Data Mining of the American Statistical Association from 2018 to 2020. She worked as a program director at the National Science Foundation from 2011 to 2013. She was visiting scientist at Google Labs in Pittsburgh from 2007 to 2008. A researcher at Xero's Palo Alto Research Center from 1999 to 2000, and a research associate in the computer science department at Stanford University in 1999. She receives a master's degree in electrical engineering in 95, a master's degree in statistics in 98, and a PhD degree in electrical engineering in 99 from Stanford University. She's a fellow of the IEEE and a fellow of the American Statistical Association. And today, she'll tell us about machine learning for bioinformatics and weather prediction. Dr. Li, the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, hi everyone, good morning. Thanks for inviting me to give the talk. And I'm going to switch to my slides. Did it work? It doesn't seem like it switched over. Can you see my slides? I'm not sure.
We can see the slides. Just put it in presentation
mode.
mode.
Okay, you can see it. Yeah, okay.
Yep. And we see it perfectly. Thank you.
The title of my talk today is Information Integration and Uncertainty Assessment for Machine Learning. Oops. Yeah, whenever someone mentions artificial intelligence, what pops up in my mind first is this robot called R2-D2 from Star Wars. I'm a big fan of Star Wars, and R2-D2 is my favorite robot in the movie and also my favorite character. And I think if I say R2-D2 is AI technology, most people would agree with me. I think most people probably would agree with me without a blink of an eye. But if I say statistics is actually an important part of AI, I would expect many people will be suspicious. Why? Why is it also part of AI? Or why does AI technology actually use a lot of statistics? And here I have a very brief and high-level explanation for that before I get to the specific techniques, which may not be that fun. Well, why do we think R2-D2 is AI technology? Because it's a machine that can make intelligent decisions. In fact, it responds to a complex environment and respond very intelligently. It responds in the way we would expect those decisions to require human intelligence, but the machine can do it. Therefore, the big question is how? How does it do it? Well, as a robot, it has to perceive the environment. It has to perceive the environment, but then the environment will then be represented mathematically in various ways. And then the machine is basically a computer. It will map this mathematical representation to a decision. Abstractly speaking, it's just a function mapping. Well, we don't really know how human brain works. It's very complex, but at least for those machines, since humans built them, we know that's how they work. They are actually doing a lot of computation to map input, which are mathematically represented into decisions. And in order to form these mapping functions, and in order to, in real time, make response, it all boils down to computation. And behind the scene, there are technologies such as machine learning and statistics, computer vision that are actually working to make this happen. That's why AI, in fact, use a lot of statistics. Well, when we mention AI, it's not just some fantasies in Hollywood movies. In fact, it's already happening in our everyday life. We may not be very aware of it because they don't take this acute form of R2-D2. Very often they're almost like virtual. They're just piece of software floating around, working in all kinds of facilities or like our cell phones, computers. We may not be very aware of them, but they're already there. We have actually been surrounded by them for decades, and getting those functions getting more and more accurate and more capable. And what I'm going to show next is actually two systems I worked on. It's just a very small part of what's happening in the technology world. I'm not going to give a survey of all this excitement going on. Just two systems I developed to give you a flavor of what is going on behind whatever you see in the software. So one project I worked on is to model the visual significance of regions in an image. You may wonder, why do you care about such a problem? For example, if I want to automatically crop an image, it would be nice if I know how human visual system feels about such image. Which part seems most attractive? How should we crop such that we don't miss important part, the most eye-catching part of the image, and also aesthetically pleasing? And to make this happen, it's all done by mathematics. So first, I have the picture, which are just an array of pixel values sent to the system. And then the computer system will automatically segment it into regions, and then use a model to compute a significant score for every region. The question is, what is the model? What kind of model? What I used is, in fact, a Markov chain, a continuous time Markov chain, where the node or the state in the Markov chain corresponds to regions in the image. And the way I construct the Markov chain is to mimic how human visual psychology respond to an image. It's actually not so obvious how we do that. In the rough sense, we are coding what the human visual systems might feel about those parts in the images, but it's not so obvious how that coding can happen. And of course, there can be different ways or different thoughts, ideas to approach this. And the particular idea I had is just to use a Markov chain, which is a very widely used probabilistic model. And with this Markov chain, with calculations happening on the Markov chain, I eventually get a significant score for the regions. And with that, we can do something real. For example, I have a picture, then the computer system would automatically crop it. And I'm showing here a few examples where the left is the original image and the right is the cropped picture. And we know that in the cell phone, this happens all the time, and the software automatically crop the center part. But that may not be the best choice in a lot of pictures. And this is basically what this system is doing, trying to inherit some intelligence from human vision through computation. And another project I worked quite many years ago is to automatically annotate images. For example, I took a picture and hopefully there's some system automatically describe the picture by some words. And nowadays, there are even fancier system that may describe the image by some sentences. But in the early days, we're just trying to recognize what's going on in the image and describe it. For example, maybe I would see a picture and say, oh, this is a garden, there's a dog, there's a girl. When we first worked on this, many people didn't believe in it, thought this is too ambitious, this is never going to happen. But recently, with advance in machine learning, the accuracy has improved tremendously, not really by my research group, actually by many, many researchers out there working in the field. And they have achieved much better accuracy. And it's actually to the point we can use it in practice. Although I have to say, we might be charmed by those software, but they're actually still far behind the intelligence of human vision. But they're good enough to the point to be useful in practice. Like nowadays, I see in cell phones, you can take a picture and then automatically some software will give you some description. And we have also seen, like in more specific domain, you take a picture of flower, the software actually tell you what kind of flowers, like is a peony or is like give you the name of the flowers by automatically recognizing what has been captured. Now I want to zoom into the more mathematical part and give you like a high level view of what machine learning is about. And as I mentioned previously, machine learning is a core technology to make AI happen. But what is machine learning? In a very short way to describe machine learning, we're just using computer systems to learn from examples. I think this is a little just like little kids. When they are growing up, they are accumulating experience and they are learning from examples. Right? Abstract is always harder, but learning from examples seems to be a very intrinsic way, a very intuitive way to learn. And that's in fact what machine learning does as well. For a machine learning algorithm, the examples exist as data. For example, if I want to classify objects into certain types, or maybe I'm going to give a very kind of funny and toy example. Let's say if I capture a fish and I try to classify what age group the fish is. For instance, let's say we know the fish only live up to say 5 years. So we know the age of the fish is either 1 to 5. And supposedly we have data. I'm not going to discuss how we get the accurate information about the age of the fish. Suppose we know that we have examples. And for those examples, we can make measurements about the fish. Let's say the weight, the length, how big the head is, for example. And those measurements are in machine learning what we call the predictor variables, and they're usually denoted by X. And then we have also the labels. In this case, because I'm concerned about the age, then the age in this case, let's say I just represent it by 5 groups, age 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And with this collection of data, we will send it into a computer system or computer algorithm based on the examples. What the computer does is to form a function. In the future, it will map X to Y. And we call this function the prediction model. And with this prediction model, in the future, if I catch a fish, I don't know what's the age of the fish, but I can make measurements. And then I take X and put it into the prediction model. The model is just a function that map X to, in this case, 1 to 5. And that gives me a prediction of the fish's age. And this is pretty much the essence of what machine learning is doing. But in reality, it's not as simple as this toy example. For example, the X can be very complex. Maybe, for example, in the companies, if they're trying to profile the customers, they might have collected a huge amount of information just about one customer. How do they make use of this very complex information to predict the behavior of the customer? For example, what kind of movies the person would like, or what kind of products the family is particularly interested in. In both cases, the predictor variables and the response Y, they both can be very complex. And that's why there's so much research going on. Here I have two pictures. I'm trying to show two types of machine learning, two big groups of machine learning that's happening. On the left-hand side, that picture represents what we call supervised learning. In this case, if we look at the examples contain both X and Y. For example, my X is just two measurements. Let's say the weight of the fish and the length of the fish. And for every fish, depending on these two measurements, I can, correspond it to a point in a two-dimensional plane. And suppose there are two types. Here I'm representing by different shape. One type is a purple circle, and the other type is red triangle. And what the training algorithm tries to do is, like a human might do, stare at this scatter plot of points and try to draw a boundary to separate the two types. For example, here, if I'm using a linear straight line as my boundary, what I have drawn here seems to be a good guess based on the examples. And that's actually what the computer algorithm is doing, except that they are not using eyeballing, and they're using fancy optimizations or mathematical principles to trying to draw those boundaries. And then in the future, if I see a point, basically I just need to check which side of the boundary it falls into. Let's say if it's above, then I'm going to guess it's the purple circle class. And if it's below, I'm going to guess it's red triangle class. I'm going to make some mistakes, but given the limited example, that might be the best I can do. In this example, it is called supervised because we actually know the types of the examples when we're forming this mapping function or this prediction model. But there are cases that we collect X, but we really don't have Y. It can happen. This may sound very strange. Then you can say it's almost like you give kids a bunch of patterns, but you don't tell them what type each is and let themselves sort it out. It's not always possible, but sometimes I think this is also very heuristic to human beings, to little kids. I have observed them, is that you give them things, they like to sort it according to similarity. They like to put things that look similar together as one group, although no one told them whether they're truly a group. But people, I think that's very fundamental to human psychology. We group things together depending on how similar they are. And this in machine learning, we have a name for it. It's called unsupervised learning. In this case, the examples don't come with labels. But then we still want to put them into groups because this just helps us to understand. For example, in the future, if I want to understand a phenomenon, I don't have to remember all the cases. I just remember there are roughly 3 types of the phenomenon. And each type, I have like an average profile for that. And in fact, in machine learning, there are many algorithms developed for unsupervised learning. Using that fish example, suppose I know the fish only have 5 age groups. I might plot those length and height data of every fish on my plane, in this scatter plane, and then I look at them and see, whether they roughly fall into 5 groups. So although no one tells me what's the age of each group, I might tend to divide them into 5 groups based on the mutual similarity among them. And these are 2 big types of machine learning algorithms. What I'm going to talk about today is actually a very specific problem. Let's say for various reasons, I'm going to elaborate in a moment, we might get predictions from different channels. And when we are faced with these different predictions, how should we leverage all the opinions? How should we benefit from all of them? And also, can we, based on those multiple opinions, can we actually form some kind of assessment about the uncertainty of any prediction model? In fact, this is not always a hard problem. For example, if what I predicted is the age of the fish, and I have different approaches to do that, let's say models given by different algorithms, one very obvious thing people would do is just to compute the average. A lot of predictions using the average is actually a very good choice, and that's really going on in the algorithm. Let's say if I have experts giving me 100 different opinions, we can compute the average. That's perfectly fine. Therefore, why is this problem interesting? Well, it is interesting because sometimes what we predicted, the Y, is not as simple as like the fish's age or some category. Itself may be of a complex mathematical entity, and therefore doing average, although we still want average, but mathematically it's just not so clear what average means in those cases. Or if we do some very straightforward, simple idea of doing average, the result has problems. I'll show such an example in a moment. I see some chat message. Let me just check it. Oh, okay.
No, we're good.
Coming back to integration. Yeah, question? Okay, I think we're fine. Going back to my previous comment, I said there can be multiple reasons why, in fact, we end up with different predictions. One reason is that people might be using different models. This happens very often in weather forecasting. I heard from my colleague that, for example, in Europe, they have their own model to predict extreme weather, and same thing in the US and in other continents. They don't actually like to use other models. And even in the US, very often meteorologists are faced with predictions given by many different models. That's one reason we might end up with many different predictions. And another reason could be we are studying the same phenomena, but the data are collected at different sites. And the data are so big that it's not realistic to actually pull them together and somehow at a central site to come up with a prediction model. And sometimes this is out of privacy concern. For example, medical data, hospitals don't really just arbitrarily share them. But what if we want to do research with such data and we're studying the same problem? How can we leverage information across different sites? And a third reason that we might get different predictions is that for the same entity, we might have collected data from different resources. They might be of very different types. For example, we might have collected speech signal of a person, and we might also have images. We might also have other just meta information about the person. And they may point to different predictions. And how can we leverage them all together? Well, as I mentioned previously, if the predicted quantity is simple, very often we just do average, and that's actually a very good choice. But in the example I'm going to show next, one is meteorology, and another example is clustering for single cell flow cytometry data. The predicted Y is so complex that we can't do simple average, and we have to develop more sophisticated methods to deal with them. And that's actually the technical part of this talk today. Let's first look at prediction of extreme weathers. And the meteorologists are often faced with simulated, let's say, simulated cloud images from different models. From what I heard from colleagues in meteorology department is they can, on the screen, they could have dozens of such simulated cloud maps showing to them. And somehow the meteorologist has to absorb all this information and come up with his own judgment. And if those cloud maps, if they look very similar, it's not a problem. We can do some average, that's fine. But the trouble is the prediction can differ a lot. And then it is curious how they do it. I asked my colleague, I said, how do they do it? This seems very hard. And then he says, it's just like experience. And it is actually not an easy task for them. That's why they get interested in the problem. Let's say if I have predicted or simulated cloud maps, they may look very different. And I suddenly have a dozen showing up as thumbnails on the screen. It's in fact very hard, even for an expert, to come up with a sort of aggregated opinion about what the weather should be. And that's what we are trying to tackle here. We want to use machine learning computation techniques to aggregate those images so that we will basically lift the burden from the meteorologist. This is a problem I call image synthesis for weather forecasting. Here I'm showing simulated cloud maps, and all the pictures I'm showing here, they are predicted cloud maps for the same location at the same time. As you can observe, they look very differently. So what should we do? If I see so many, what kind of information I can extract out of this? Well, if we use straightforward ideas like pixel-wise average, because every simulated cloud map is just a grayscale picture, and they are of the same size. I can do an average at every pixel. Let's say I have 20 models. At every pixel, I take the predicted value from these 20 models and compute the average, and then form an average image. For example, here I have two ensembles, and I computed the average for the two ensembles. Each one contains about 40 simulated cloud maps. And then I show this to the colleague, and he said, this is almost useless. We are not experts, so I don't know why it's not useful for him, but I think for him, he said, if you look at this, it's just like a smeared patch, which does not show any structure or anything that useful in terms of the moving of the cloud. And although mathematically we might think this is a natural choice, for them, this is not helpful at all. So we have worked together to develop this system called geometry sensitive ensemble mean. The acronym is GEM. And I'm showing a schematic plot of the system. It looks like a machine, but it's actually everything happening in the computer as algorithms. And I'll explain more details in a moment. But this is the big picture. We will take the image, we will segment it into clouds, the cloud patches, and then for every patch, we will summarize it. And then this summarized information for every image is what we call an image signature. And this signature will send into a core engine so that we can aggregate them. And it turned out, because the way we represent the image is not very common. It's no longer just a vector, like an array of values. It's actually an unordered set, which I'm going to explain in a moment. And that caused mathematical difficulty for handling them. And then we use this method called D2 clustering to cluster them, and then use the computation method called Wasserstein barycenters to compute average of such complex objects. And then at the end, we will, after we have aggregated using all these mathematical methods, we will convert it back to a simulated cloud map. And that serves as an aggregation for the whole set of pictures. And we can aggregate when it comes to details. After the core things are done, we may present it in different ways. That's what the green box is about. We can present the image as what we call a mixture density mean or Bayesian posterior mean or in-sample mean under rigid motion. I'll give you some examples. And we can also use this engine to help us cluster the images in one ensemble into multiple groups, so that every group, within the group, it is similar, but then between the group, the difference is more dramatic. And then we can have a summary for every group. In that way, one ensemble of cloud simulations is not just one image. It can come with several images if the predicted cloud maps are too different from by different models. And here again, I'm diving into more mathematical details here, but I think I don't have too many such slides. The core problem here is a matter of representation. We can represent an image, just think of it as a map of pixel values. That's what I call a pixel representation. On the plot on the left-hand side, the pixel representation has very high dimensions because its dimension is just the size of the image. That causes difficulty. And one other extreme is to extract some summary statistics about the picture. For example, on average, where the cloud locates and how much on average the spread is. And then that will reduce the dimension dramatically, but it may not be adequate to describe what's going on. So these are two extremes. One may be too over summarized. Another is without any summary, actually does not give us any direct information about the structure of the clouds. And then there's something in between where we would perform segmentation of the cloud patches. And then for every patch of cloud have a summary about it. Let's say its location, how much it's spread, what's the intensity. And then the cloud is broken into multiple patches. And therefore we end up with a collection of patches to describe the image. And that's a more sophisticated representation. It is unordered because we have a bunch of patches. They are not ordered in any way. And this mathematically will raise some challenge when we want to, for example, even to compute distance between different images. And on the right-hand side, I'm using a picture to show the complexity of distance when it comes to dimensionality. When the dimension is higher, the complexity of computing distance between two objects become higher, as you can see by the straight line at the bottom. But that's not the most challenging part. The most challenging part is when we represent an image as a set of cloud patches, and then that becomes an unordered set. Mathematically, we have to use the so-called Wasserstein distance to compute how similar those images are. And that raises both computation challenge and also challenges for machine learning for later stages. And here I'm going to show you how we actually process the image and come up with a summary about the picture instead of using the raw pixel representation. Here we have to consider both accuracy and as well as efficiency of such representation. And what we did is first to segment the patches into many, many small pieces so that instead of handling the image at the pixel level, we're handling it at this small blobs level. And that gives us gain in computation efficiency. And then based on those small blobs of the pixels, we will perform clustering and you essentially divide the cloud into patches, which I'm showing here by those boundaries with different colors. And then at last, for every patch of image, we will fit a Gaussian distribution. I think if you don't know what Gaussian distribution is, a graphical way to imagine this is I'm going to approximate every patch by an ellipse. So the ellipse has a center location, and that captures the center location of that cloud patch. And it also has a corresponding rotation and the amount of spread. Those are captured in the geometry of the ellipses. And then we record all such statistics and form a set. And that is the set that represents every cloud map. And here, I just have more examples here. As we can see, I have a big yellow circle. That just shows if we don't perform clustering into cloud patches and just treat the whole cloud simulation as one patch and fit an ellipse to it, it often is hard to capture what's really going on in the cloud simulation. I guess in a simple word, using one Gaussian to capture the whole cloud map is just too limited. And I'm showing you with this yellow circle here, as we can see, very often the location of the big yellow circle does not even locate at any cloud when we have multiple patches spread out across the picture. And that's why it is actually quite necessary for us to divide the cloud map into patches, and then for every localized patch, fit an ellipse to that, and then represent the whole image by a collection of ellipses. This brings us to a mathematical problem. If we compare that simple example I gave about classifying the age of the fish based on some measurement, in that case, our input is just a bunch of numbers, right? What we call a vector, because we arrange them in a certain order, and that's a vector. But here, every image is actually represented by a collection of vectors, and each one has a weight to it. Probabilistically speaking, that's equivalent to a discrete distribution. Here I have some examples to show where we could have this pop up in our analysis. For example, if I'm analyzing the document, we might represent the document by how many times each word has appeared. In this case, every word is like an atom in my set, and then it has a frequency associated with it. Or maybe if I'm analyzing a picture, this picture might have been divided into blocks, and then for every block, let's say we have clustered or quantized them into some categories, and they are like representative blocks, and we have a weight or frequency associated with them, so on. And also, for example, in protein sequence analysis, the protein sequence might be represented by a distribution of different types of proteins. All those examples, what I would call a composite objects. They are no longer just one vector, they're actually a distribution over multiple vectors. And it might sound strange, for these objects, even to compute the distance is not trivial. And we all learned if I have points in Euclidean space, for example, our 3D space, if I want to compute distance, I think in middle school, that formula is given. We know how to compute distance between 2 points. But here, the matter of computing distance actually becomes challenging, because we have, for every object, we have a bunch of points, and they have different weights. How should we handle that? Here, I'm trying to illustrate the idea using a graph on the bottom left, bottom right. Imagine we have two objects, one represented by those blue dots, another represented by these orange dots. Here, every object itself is a collection of those dots. And the Wasserstein distance is actually a weighted average of the distance between every pair of dots across these two objects. And we don't arbitrarily put a weight. In fact, we decide how much weight to put on every pair of dots using the technique called linear programming. We set up this optimization framework. We want to find a set of weights such that those weights satisfy certain boundary conditions, and in the meanwhile minimize this weighted sum of distance. And this optimal solution to this linear programming problem is what defined as the Wasserstein distance. And why is it an interesting distance to use? Here I have 4 pictures. What I'm trying to illustrate is, let's say if I have 4 dots in the image plane, and every dot has a certain weight assigned to it. Here I'm representing the weight by the brightness of the dot. If it's bright, then that means I put a higher weight at that point. Therefore, if you look at the bottom, I have this kind of like bar charts to represent the weights of every dot. Let's say if I number those dots as 1, 2, 3, 4, then in every image, every dot has a certain weight associated with it. And normally, if we just think of this distribution as a vector, which is just a frequency over the 4 dots, we would think the distance between these 4 images are the same, because the only thing changed is that the most dominant dot gets moved. And if we just take these 4 bar charts and treat them as a vector and compute distance, there's no difference between those 4 images. But the Wasserstein distance is not working like that. It actually takes into consideration where the dots locate in the image, not just how their frequency differ. Actually, there is a distance associated with that, as well as the frequency taken into consideration. And as we can see that for the image B and A, the distance is the smallest because the shifting of the dominant dot is between 2 points or 2 locations which are close by. But then if we move to image C and D, the distance become larger because the dominant dot actually moved farther away from the first reference image. And then here I just have some examples showing using this engine, which we call the GEM, to generate various forms of average for a collection of images. Here I'm showing 3 rows. Every row corresponds to a different way of generating the average cloud map. And then every column corresponds to a different granularity of representing the cloud maps. And this is just an example for the second ensemble. And as I mentioned, we can also use the technique to divide images in one ensemble into groups. If they differ too much, we want to, this is also a very useful summary to see what are the major groups and how each group looks like. Here, I'm showing 3 groups. As you can see, images in one column correspond to images in the same group. They indeed are relatively similar. And if we compare across groups, indeed, they are more different. And this is just for another ensemble. I think that's just more results. I want to move to the next example. This is called single cell flow cytometry, and it's a relatively new biotechnology that allow people to collect measurements at the cell level. In the past, when tissues are, for example, collected from a patient in order to perform diagnosis, the measurements about the tissues are just a bunch of numbers at the tissue level. But now technology has allowed us to actually make measurements at the cell level. For every cell, for example, we may measure gene expression levels of thousands of genes. And therefore, every sample, every tissue sample, for example, let's say if it corresponds to 1 patient, is no longer just a bunch of measurements. It's actually a whole big data set. Every cell contains a bunch of measurements. That bunch of can be pretty big. And then the number of cells in each tissue can easily go up to thousands or tens of thousands. And this raises a lot of interesting questions for machine learning and data analysis. And for such data, for biologists, one early analysis step they always go through is to cluster the cells into groups. Otherwise, there are just too many of them. And also, if they want to understand what's going on in the tissue, it's not realistic to look at all the cells. So they have invented ways to cluster those cells in every sample. And then that result may be used for later analysis. Therefore, the one challenge we are facing here is, for example, if I have multiple tissues about, let's say from the same patient or maybe to study the same disease, and then we have the single cell data and they are clustered to form those groups. What if we have multiple results? How are we going to aggregate or maybe average them with quote average so that we have an understanding of the whole phenomenon? It turned out because the output is not one numerical value, but it's a partition of a set. This becomes a challenge. Let's, for example, look at some toy examples here. I have, say, the center is one example clustering. They generated 3 clusters. But then let's say I have another, either different algorithm or from different time, whatever the reason is, I have created another result. In this case, we compare the 2 clustering results. They are in fact identical, but the algorithms might have given them different labels, which I'm indicating here by different color. So if we want to aggregate the result, we can't just do some average across, for example, the red class with the red class in another result, because they are actually different clusters. We have to first figure out which matches to which. This is what we call a label permutation issue. This may not sound very challenging, right? I mean, we look at the picture, it looks like it's very clear. We can do it like without any thinking. And indeed, if the correspondence is crispy, this is not a hard problem at all. But in reality, the correspondence is not that crispy. We don't really see like one cluster in one result get duplicated in another. And therefore, there's question, how should we align them? And in addition to the fact the correspondence may be pretty vague, there's also complex topological relationships. As I'm trying to show on the right-hand side, we may have a cluster, for example, split. When I move to a different result, my previous cluster obtained in result 1 gets split into multiple in another cluster. How can we detect that? And we have to keep in mind, on top of this, nothing is that crispy. Even if there is split happening, it doesn't mean exactly we have one bunch of points split perfectly into 2. There might be overlapping with other clusters. Everything is vague. Then the question is, how can we make decision? How can we make decision which clusters correspond to what? And the technique we use is the so-called optimal transport. The optimal transport, very interestingly, it was not developed for such purpose. It appeared, this mathematical problem appeared more than 200 years ago. And it was studied a lot in the 50s, 1950s and 60s. And it was used for economical reason, to study the problem of matching supply with demand. Let's say if I have supply of certain goods and then their demand, we want to ship the supply to various sites of the demand. And we want to do it in a smart way such that the cost of shipping from the supply to the demand is minimized. That's originally where this problem pops up, right? That's why it's called optimal transport. The original problem is trying to minimize the transportation cost of matching supply and demand. But what's interesting about mathematics is that a lot of seemingly different problems at the abstract level, they are identical problems. As what I have shown, when we define the Wasserstein distance between two sets of points, the Wasserstein distance is a metric between distributions, and it is actually solved, at least in the discrete case, by optimal transport. Although it has nothing to do with the economy, it's just a mathematical problem. And that's what we used here to match the clusters obtained by different algorithms. And here I just have a pipeline of a system we developed. We called it CPS analysis. And we have an R-CRAN package called OT classed. What it does is to allow people to aggregate clustering results without really observing the original data. This is a very nice feature because technologies. And then our system will take those different results using optimal transport to align them and some additional mathematical algorithm to finally aggregate them into an average result. And in addition to that, this again, because of the mathematical link between those problems, we can also use this to assess the uncertainty of a clustering result. For people working on unsupervised learning, we know that unsupervised learning results can change a lot depending on the data. Even if the data change a little bit, the algorithm might spit out very different results. Or if we initialize the algorithm somewhat differently, we also get very different results. So the question is, if I use an algorithm to give me a clustering result, how sure can I be about the result, right? How much uncertainty is there? This problem, if we're working with very low dimensional data, we may have a simple solution to that. We can just plot the data and look at them. That will give us very direct impression about, how trustworthy the result is. But unfortunately, in reality, when we work with machine learning, we will never run into a problem like the classifying the fish age I made up. That is just a toy problem. We always have data with such high dimensions. It's impossible to visualize them in 2D, but unfortunately we can only see things in 2D or 3D. But those data always live in extremely high dimensions, hundreds or thousands of dimensions. We can cluster them using mathematical algorithm, no problem. But the problem is we can really not rely on human eyeballing to decide whether the result is reasonable. And that's the whole point of us developing tools like this to help people understand how much uncertainty there is in clustering. And because the clustering result is not one number, it is actually hard to assess the uncertainty. That's why all these intricacies in the algorithms are involved. It is really because the output itself is not a simple mathematical entity. It's something more complex. Here are just some details about what that system can provide. I'm going to skip those. For example, we can provide a membership heat map in addition to tell people which points should belong to which group. We also have the heat map to tell people how reliable this point belongs to a certain group. And so on. These technologies can be used for various reasons besides aggregating results and producing uncertainty assessment. We may use it to select visualization method. We can use the method to see which visualization method would retain the clustering structure the best. For example, that's one criterion we could use to select visualization methods. And we can also use the method to select data generation technologies. For example, in single cell data, there are different technologies that generate single cell data. Some are more expensive than others, but the more expensive ones, the good good side about that is they provide more complete information. But then the question is, how should we balance? Should we spend a lot of money to get them? Or should we just use a cheaper technology that if it retains the essential information, then we would prefer the cheaper one. So how do we judge whether it has retained the key information? And that's what our method can be applied to judge whether any type of technology has retained the essential information in the data. Well, I hope I have not bored you too much with the math content. And this is my last slide. And here's Mr. Question Mark saying, R2D2, you must have more tricks. Show me, please. I have gone through a bunch of things from machine learning, but that's definitely not all. And R2D2 says next time, next time. That's all for my talk today.
Thank you. I'm because of Zoom, I'm the only one that gets to clap for you. As we usually do, so thank you very much for the talk. You have the question and answers tab right there under your screen, and that's where you can type your questions and we'll read them for you. While you do that, I remind you that before you leave or when you leave, there will be an option to give us feedback. So please take a minute and do so. And while I wait for your questions, I also tell you that next week we will have the next lecture, which will be by Dr. Ashley Villar, and she will tell us about the origin of the heavy elements. All right, so team, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see questions yet. So I was wondering if in the meantime, while we wait, you could tell me a little bit what's behind this Googling of images that is getting so popular now. That, you know, what is the behind this? You instead of searching, Google search a string of text, you can just submit an image and Google it.
Yeah, I think what you are talking about is the technology called image retrieval, where you are not retrieving images based on the text description, but based on the similarity of the appearance of the picture. And that's actually a very active research topic starting in the mid-1990s. And I actually worked on it. I wrote multiple papers about that. And what they are doing in the early days is just to define some kind of similarity between the images. And in fact, the technique I talked about, for example, optimal transport, even back a long time ago, I used it to define distance between images. And we used to have an image search engine called Simplicity. Actually, it's hosted at Penn State, that you can submit a picture without any description, and then it will go to this database and find the images the system believes look similar to what you submitted. And I believe nowadays, because the technology in machine learning has advanced a lot, people can generate more accurate word description of the images. I don't know exactly what Google does. They might be using that information as well. Instead of purely based on pixel, they might have first generated some descriptive words. Like if they can generate something like this is a dog or that's a garden, they might use that and then to search through the text. I don't know, actually, I don't know how Google, you know, what they do in their system, in their image system, but that's
right, but
yeah.
But at the same time, so I was thinking about that in the sense that, you know, you talk about the training, how you train a system, and this has to be something similar, right? They have to use a bunch of images and then train their AI system and say, you know, then you respond. But they get so many more images by the minute. So it's like they have to train the training algorithm to keep adding all the new images.
Yeah, that's why they have huge computation power. That's not something, I think the access to computing power is way beyond what the university can access. Like big companies like Google or Amazon, you know, another advantage they have is they have access to so many images, you know, because they are the search engine, right? And also in some social media companies, people keep their images in their account. So they indeed have a huge amount of resource, both in terms of computation and data.
Yeah. So we have a question from Abai. So I'll read it for everybody, just in case they don't get to see it, but you'll have it there. You mentioned supervised and unsupervised machine learning, but not reinforcement machine learning. Is it because you don't use it? Or if not, why not? So naively, it would seem to be useful for the two problems you described to significantly improve the outcome.
Right, yeah, so of course, the supervised and the unsupervised are two big categories. They're not everything. For example, nowadays, very hot technology is like what they call semi-supervised, or it could be self-supervised. But these are the two really fundamental ones. And for reinforcement learning, I'm actually not an expert on that. I believe there's a feedback, right? So there's a feedback, and then they try to make a sequence of decisions, not just like one decision based on one data input. They're trying to make a sequence of decisions that is optimized. And then there's a framework, not exactly the same as the very basic setup of machine learning.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. I'll give you a minute, like we do in class. If there are any more questions, please type them. If not, I'm gonna thank Dr. Li again. Okay, so we have another question. Have you worried about the training of artificial intelligence systems from data sets that are biased by how the data are collected? These biases are common with criminology. Thank you for the question, James.
Yes, that's actually that's a great question. It is a very important problem, in fact. There's now a sub-area called AI fairness, and I think people do a lot of research there to study, for example, how biased data collection or other reasons might influence the decision. And sometimes it's just not that people deliberately made the data bias. It's just the way the data are collected. Maybe certain groups are better represented by some other groups. And then when we train the system, maybe the system will work better for certain groups, but not the others. And then there are other subtle issues. There's a lot of going on in this area called AI fairness. That's definitely a very important question, in fact.
Thank you. And thank you for the question too. So remember, so before you leave, when you leave the seminar, you will either get a post survey immediately in Zoom or in your email within the next day. So please take a minute to fill this out and help us determine how to make the future lectures more engaging and popular. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming today. Next week's webinar will be at the same time, same link, and the topic will be the origin of the heavy elements presented by Dr. Ashley Villar. So Dr. Li, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
And we'll see you all next week. Bye.
Okay, bye.